Welcome to Medusa is Framed. My name is Joyce, and you can find me with our ensemble at onguruyourlife.com, a private business club, research team, and life skills ensemble. Hey guys, thanks for popping in. Today, I'm going to take you through a little stroll of Huguenot Cemetery. So this is a place that's near my house where I was going to go yesterday and take some pictures inside. The place has low walls, and if you wanted to be a hoodlum, you could jump the walls or bust through the chain link fence. But that's not my thing. People have done that. You can see it. I respect that it is the resting place of the dead. One or more historical societies open the Huguenot and the Tolomado cemeteries once a month, third Saturday of the month, from 10 to 2. They provide informational materials, resource materials, even tours if you're interested. Sometimes there are people dressed up in period costume, reenacting a famous person who might have been laid to rest there and that type of thing. I've done that with great success for the Tolomado Cemetery, and as you may know, an interesting video came out of that. I intended to do that today here too, but unfortunately, no one showed up to open the gates. So I guess I didn't get the memo because there didn't seem to be anyone else waiting to go in either. So I bummed around in the visitor center, which has a museum, a little bit, and took the pictures that I could from the walls, nabbed some pictures from DuckDuckGo, and just did some research trying to put things together for you. So let's explain the name first. Huguenots, we may think of as a French Protestant movement, all that French revolutionary stuff. Though there may be some French Huguenots buried in the cemetery, the way the term was used here was simply to refer to people that were not Catholic. The cemeteries in the city, the Tolomado specifically, was attached to a Catholic church and a Catholic cemetery. If you wanted to be buried within the city walls, you had to be Catholic. Otherwise, you were just cast to the land. We had 2 yellow fever outbreaks here in St. Augustine, as much of the South did. And the bodies were literally piling up at one point outside the city gates. So when St. Augustine was an American colony, finally, decisions were made to build a cemetery outside the city gates so as not to upset the Catholics inside the city, to lay to rest the people that were there. So right next door to the cemetery here, if you were to look to the right of the right gate in the trees, right next to there is a visitor center where there are lots of wonderful maps. You've seen some of those maps in my videos in the past. I use these maps as an example of the truth being right in front of everyone's faces, but they don't know to look. There are a couple big maps, snazzy big maps, colored of city and the city plan. You see the Star Fort. You see how small the city actually was at various times, Star Fort being the main bastion there. But the city was small, just a few blocks. The next thing I want to draw your attention to while we're looking at maps, though, is this that I took yesterday with my phone. This is on a big map that you've seen that's on the wall. And it refers to this map being officially entered or drawn, either of the two, a date that ends in J788. Now that's something that we've talked about before, the whole date hijack. Scaliger, the historian, what happened with that 1,000 years? I'm going to leave that up to you. There are a lot of people that have done a lot of very in-depth videos about that. Awarenon. Campbell at Autodidactic has done a few good things. There's a lot of stuff out there. Mind Unveiled. I'm just going to keep it simple. We have a couple examples in the History Museum of the Visitor Center, as well as in at least the Huguenot Cemetery. Now, I can't say that there's anything to indicate this in the Huguenot Cemetery since I didn't get in. But you can see on this map, does that say 1788? Or does it say J788? We don't write things this way anymore, but we refer to dates in the modern time as being AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. 2222. Well, different cultures, different languages would use different ways to make that reference. They might not have used AD. They might have referred to the gentleman himself. Some cultures have used a J to refer to Yeshua. I think in the Greek transition, historically, the documents were written with an I, iuska, that being more of, and I said that wrong, but that being more appropriate for that. So you might see an I before the date or a J before the date. That J referring to the reference of time, the way that we use AD. So there's at least one headstone that I can remember at the Huguenot Cemetery where there's a J before the date in the 1800s of the person being laid to rest. It says J8 something, 8 blah blah. This says J788. So was this map submitted in 1788 or was this map submitted in 788? The reference with Scaliger, the scallywag, uses the premise that he, a self-schooled linguist, set out to translate ancient documents to hold up the expectations of the Catholic Church, used references like this, I's and J's, and in some cases even X's before the date, to manipulate and add 1,000 years that actually didn't exist, creating a blank screen to create a narrative. So I'll just leave that there and ask you what you think that says. I also found examples of that in the museum at the Nombre de Dios, Our Lady of la Leche, the first Catholic church erected here in St. Augustine. There are also documents in there where there have been modifications made. But again, I let you decide what you think things say and what those things say means. So this is the same map that is reproduced all over the visitor center. Some are colored, some are black and white. Same map. The area down on the bottom left corner is from the close-up that I showed earlier with the date, but right under the star, you can see there's some writing, and then there's a date. I want you to look closely here at this date. because something doesn't quite look right to me. Does it look like there has been a change to that date? See that? That doesn't look quite right to me. Looks modified. You might not be able to tell here in this black and white one. There is a colored version on the wall too, but I couldn't get close to it. It was very busy. There was a date of the 1800s, and there has, without a doubt, been a 1 added with a different tool than was originally used to write. It's even in a different color. Now, I'm not sure exactly what all this says, but I think that the whole thing was drawn in the 1700s, was based on a drawing from the 1700s, and this was put together, this document. I don't read Spanish well enough to translate all of this. This is some kind of notes after the fact, when this was submitted, sometime in the 1800s. I think that that 1 was added after the fact, well after the fact. But again, I'll let you decide what you think it means. Right in plain sight. People just don't think about what they're looking at. This is just a nice little example of the visitor center and some of the visuals there. This is what was called Governor's House. It's still referred to Governor's House. It's where the Spanish governor during the Spanish periods lived. It was also the jail and the courthouse. Down here we have some drawings of what life would have been like and what things were like at the coquina quarries. Coquina, which built everything back then. A difficult time to live, a difficult time to be a slave, a difficult time to be an indigenous person living on the East Coast of Florida. Though it was more difficult under British rule than Spanish, we are told to believe. In any case, a lot of people were abused and killed. And yeah, generally, times were not very good. So, the Huguenot Cemetery. There is a historical marker right out on San Marco, right in front of the grounds. It actually stands between the fence line of the Huguenot Cemetery and the Visitor Center. It was established in 1821 and it received internments until 1884. Both the Tolomado inside the city gates and the Huguenot Cemetery outside the city gates were closed in 1884 because of the second outbreak of yellow jack, when people felt that it was just too dangerous to be disturbing the ground. At first, it was a potter's field, meaning they just buried dead people there because the bodies were lining up. And within this half acre are over 400 known burials. Not all the known burials have names. There's just a record of yellow jack victims being buried there. One would imagine that they were stacked at some point to get that many people into a half acre. So St. Augustine was Spanish territory. Then, through the First Treaty of Paris, St. Augustine was ceded to the British in exchange for Cuba. The British were here for 20 years, built up the plantation system, and then it was ceded back to the Spanish. And in 1819, the Adams-Honest Treaty transferred the territory to America. It basically created the southern boundaries of the USA with Spain. It created the boundary between America and Mexico, and it ceded Florida to America. Also known as the Florida Purchase Treaty. There was a lot going on back then. It's actually pretty interesting to read about Andrew Jackson and John Adams and what was going on up there on the Florida border with all of those southern states and just everything that was going on in Louisiana all the way over to California. There was a lot of tumult. We certainly have a lot of indigenous horror stories here in Florida. The entire Treaty of Moultrie Creek and trying to round the indigenous up and put them on reservations here or ship them up into the Trail of Tears up into Oklahoma and Alabama. But though it's not a pleasant read, all that was going on prior to the Adams-Onis Treaty is pretty interesting. So this was signed in 1819. The Americans didn't actually come in politically and occupy the city until 1821. In that same year, Yellow Jack started just whacking everybody. Bodies were literally piling up outside the gates and inside the gates, does that matter? And so it was under the American occupation that this was built. So a Reverend Thomas Alexander had been deeded this property through a process. He was at the Presbyterian church that we are to believe Flagler built in 1 year, the Grand Presbyterian Church, that we are to believe Flagler built for his daughter who had passed away, Jenny Cruz Flagler Benedict, right after giving birth. Even though it's full of Moorish architecture and a copper dome, you're supposed to believe that that was built in a year. Interestingly enough, by the same architects who are attributed with constructing his two hotels, the Ponce de Leon and the Alcazar, that being Carrere and Hastings. And I asked the same question again. The city of Hastings, which is west of St. Augustine, which is known as the potato region of Florida, a town that was established to grow the vegetables for the restaurants at the Ponce de Leon Hotel, at the Alcazar Hotel, was named after Flagler's cousin, Thomas Hastings. The Hastings of this Carrere and Hastings collaboration is also Thomas Hastings. Do you think they're the same? It's not a very uncommon name, right? Thomas Hastings, that's a common name. But of course, I don't think any of this stuff that happened really happened quite the way it was written down, certainly where slugs like Flagler are concerned. Reverend Thomas Alexander had the land and he turned it over to the Presbyterian Church in 1832. Became officially a non-Catholic burial, a public burial. That's when it started to be known as Huguenot, simply referring to non-Catholic. We still had the Huguenot Cemetery inside the city gates, Catholic, with some fairly influential people in the history of St. Augustine buried there, also protected. So 1821, the first outbreak of yellow fever. In this period of time, there are a listing of 436 people buried on this half-acre. It's listed as the most haunted cemetery here. And if you've been watching my videos, you know we have quite a few cemeteries for the size of the city, the population of the city at the time, though remember that this was the capital of Florida during both Spanish occupations and the British occupation, and even in the beginning of the American occupation, St. Augustine was the capital. There are two primary stories of the most visible haunted individuals, that being an anonymous 14-year-old girl who was dumped at the city gates during the early days of the outbreak. No one claimed her, so she was buried completely anonymously in this new potter's field. People claim to see her between midnight and 2 a.m. in the gates. There's also the story of Judge John Stickney. He was born to a wealthy family in Massachusetts in 1832 and passed away 1882. Yale-trained lawyer, skull and bones. He enlisted in the Civil War, leaving his law practice when that began. He became a captain in the artillery division. He was also a Florida state's attorney after the war. He moved to Florida, St. Augustine, after the war. Again, this being the capital. But he kept his business endeavors up in the East, in Washington, D.C., and in Boston. Now, he had a trip coming up to D.C. for more business where he had family members. He wasn't doing very well, we are told, as time was coming up for that trip. And of course, in those days, it was harrowing. His wife had recently passed away, leaving him a widower with 4 children to raise. He made the trip, but he was sick upon arrival and sick for 5 days. After 5 days being sick in DC, he passed away. Story goes of typhoid and brain tumor in 1882. Well, the swampy places were prone to make people sick then, that's for sure. And DC is a swamp. So anyway, the family requested that his body be returned to St. Augustine for burial. The ceremony was held in the Episcopalian Church, which is over on King Street, across from the huge burial. He was a big deal. He was state's attorney. He was a big deal. He was a carpetbagger. He was a skull and bones lawyer. And he was buried, because he wasn't Catholic, at the Huguenot Cemetery. Well, his children now were orphaned. So family members decided to pack them up and ship them up to DC, where family members raised them. So years later, as they became older, they wanted them near them. The kids wanted dad near him. So they had him exhumed in 1903 and shipped up. And apparently his remains remain buried at Rock Creek Cemetery, which you might recognize as part of Rock Creek Park up there, the Maryland side. So now the story gets interesting. There's a couple stories about this. One makes it seem an innocent mistake. One seems like a big made-up story that some of the ghost tellers use. So the one that sounds reasonable to me was that the grave diggers exhumed him. If you've been to Florida, you know that it's hot all the time. So the grave diggers went to dig him up, and they needed to take a break because it's hot here, and there was no air conditioning in the early 1900s. So they took a break, they sought shade, they did what they did. They had dug the coffin up. I don't know if the coffin was yet removed from the dirt, but it was exposed. Now, everyone in town knew who this dude was. They knew who Judge Stickney was. His burial was a public event. if he was buried with jewelry or anything fine at all. Everyone knew. So the story goes, the workers did what they needed to do. They went to get some water. They went to the bathroom. They took a siesta, whatever they did. When they came back, they found that the coffin had been opened and someone had pried out his gold teeth. There wouldn't have been much left of this body that you would recognize. So when they shipped the coffin to Washington, D.C., they wouldn't have had an open casket ceremony, right? So no one would have known if his teeth had been hacked out of his skull, or had he been wearing any jewelry. If it was gone, no one would know that. Anyway, story goes that you can see the judge day and night as a man dressed in the fine attire of the time, walking around, looking down at the ground, looking for his teeth. That's one version of the story. The other version of the story is that the exhumation, like the burial, was a public event, a big deal. And that people lined the streets, lined the perimeters of the cemetery. So that would have been San Marco on the east, Orange on the south, Cordova on the west, and would have been a part of, I don't know the name of the street that might have existed at the time on the north side, but where the north fence is now. Anyway, they lined all the walls to get a view of the judge being exhumed. And when the gravediggers opened the coffin, lo and behold, the judge was in perfect condition, even after close to 20 years. And so everyone was spooked and ran away. And so were the gravediggers. Everyone ran away and abandoned the open coffin. And that is when the criminals came and hacked out his teeth. Those are the two stories. You decide which one you like better. Those are the two ghost stories. I didn't see either of them yesterday when I was looking around the cemetery, but I also wasn't looking. Maybe sometime I'll go over there at night. It is about a 10-minute walk only from my house. Now, there are some notable burials there, notable in the city. And again, I love finding this stuff out. Sometimes the more you dig, the more you're able to put things together. And so I enjoyed learning about these notable people that are buried there. We're going to start with Colonel William Felix Mickler, who I was not able to get a shot of the stone for, but I found a photo online for you. He fought in the Florida Indian Wars, served on the Florida House from 1860 to 1861, made his living as a civil engineer, and he was the last survivor of the Secession Convention. Mickler, or Mickler, is a very prominent family in the area. He's not the only Mickler that's buried there at the Huguenot Cemetery. These are the descendants of the original, as we call them here, Menorcan, to work in indenture in what is now New Smyrna Beach, indigo and sugar plantation down there that became a complete debacle. These British merchants that came over and started plantations were absolute pigs, 9 times out of 10. And in this case, after working off all or most of their indenture, these Caucasian residents of different parts of the Mediterranean region, be it North Africa, the Greek islands, the islands off the coast of Spain, including Majorca and such, came here and revolted. And basically, these people just left the plantation in New Smyrna Beach after a lot of violence, packed up and left, came down to St. Augustine with permission from the governor here and started a new life. These people went on to be primary names here in the region. You see them with their names on parks and streets and beaches. We have more than one Mickler or Mickler Street here in St. Augustine. There's a Mickler Beach. Very influential family. Also, the famous St. Augustine Lighthouse. There was more than one Mickler that was a lighthouse keeper. We have a couple Congress people. There was Congressman Gadsden Bigelow, who served in the Massachusetts House from 1821 to 1823. In 1852, he moved to Florida for health. Florida at the time really just being St. Augustine. Then there was Congressman Charles Downing. He served as the Florida Secretary of State from 1837 to 1841. He's also buried there. Then we have another huge name in the area, Pachetti or Pacetti. There are streets, there are schools, there are roads, there are parks. I know some Pachettis here in St. Augustine. There are landowners that are still raising beef, Pachetti farms. There is a Douglas Pachetti who died at the young age of 17 in 1879 that's buried there as well. Now, if you've watched my videos, you know I've talked frequently about the plantations that were here in south of here in what is now called Flagler County, the indigo rice, sugarcane plantations, actually all the way down to the end of the peninsula at Ponce Inlet, where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Halifax River, where the next lighthouse down the road is, south of Daytona. The biggest plantation in what we now call Flagler County was the Bulow plantation. It's a fascinating ruin. If you are archaeo-curious, the way I am, and enjoy ruins. You might know from some of my earlier videos describing all the horrible things that happened here with the indigenous, how they were ghettoed and corralled and reservationed. Those who wouldn't make the Trail of Tears hike were condensed into the reservation, ghettoed, as it were. And the one of the three Indian Wars, Seminal Wars that were fought here, the second Seminal War, happened when the indigenous chiefs, their Congress, shall we say, including Osceola and Micanopy, realized that the American government was lying and that they had no intention of keeping any of the promises that they wrote they would. If you do this, if you give up your land and fishing rights here and hunting rights, and if you move down into this area here, we'll make sure that you get this food and this money and this stuff, and we leave you alone, and we let you live, and we let you hunt, we let you fish. Well, they realized that that was all a big lie. It wasn't going to happen. And what they did in 1842 was burn all the plantations down. Yep. Burned all the plantations. Now, there are several plantation ruins that you can go to, from St. Augustine all the way down, probably to, well, south of New Smyrna Beach. And what ruins are there, some of them, depending on the materials that they were built with, you can see burn scarring, especially if they were built out of coquina. Bulow was built from the coquina that was quarried from what are now the flooded quarries at the base of the Matanzas River, which is the subject of another video I did. There are old coquina quarries at the bottom of the Matanzas River, all through what is now Flagler Beach. That would have been land back then. You can look at old maps and see that there was no river there then. That was all diverted or has changed through other diversions. But there were coquina quarries there, just as there are coquina crops on the beaches along much of Florida and all the way up into Virginia, in fact. So Bulow was built with coquina. So the wooden things burned, but the coquina didn't burn because it's limestone. It has certainly deteriorated over time, but it didn't burn down. So if you go to the old Bilo Plantation ruins, which is right off of, well, there's more than one entrance. There's an entrance on Old Kings Road and there's an entrance on US 1. You can see much of the old ruins, which I have photos of here. But you can also see the scarring from the fire. So Colonel Charles Bulow, he was a wealthy merchant that was living in Charleston, South Carolina. He was called to St. Augustine during the transition from Spain to US control. And in the land boom plantation run, he was deeded 6,000 acres in what is now known as Flagler Beach. He had slaves, they all did then. And it's noted that of that 6,000 acres, the slaves were able to clear 2,500 acres because it's marsh and swamp and pine grove to plant what became the largest sugarcane plantation and distillery in Florida. He maintained a bayfront home in St. Augustine, as many did. And he died an untimely death, which I haven't found out why, at the young age of 44 in 1823. Well, his son had been sent from an early age to Europe to be educated, we are told. He was a mere 17, studying in Paris when Colonel Charles passed away. So he was summoned home to take over the plantation. Apparently he did. Thought that it might be a good idea to get in on the commerce of what was going on at the time, and so decided to expand into rice, indigo, and cotton as well. There was an 1830 census that was taken, listing there being 46 cabins around the Bilo property that was slaves and indentured, and 197 men, women, and children living there on the Bilo plantation. Audubon is a name you might know, the famous ornithologist who did wonderful drawings of birds and other wildlife. Audubon Park, downriver from Tulane University in New Orleans, is named after Audubon. He came through Florida in the 1830s, end of the 1820s into the 1830s, doing research, collecting drawings for his book, Birds of America. And he is said to have stayed at the Bilo plantation from the winter and Christmas of 1830 into January of 1831. And in his book, the drawing of greater yellowlegs was done on the Bilo plantation. Bilowville is what they called it. We refer to it now as Bilo or the Bulow plantation, but it was known as Bilowville at the time. So John, the son of the colonel, supposedly got along very well with the indigenous people. Don't know if that's made up, right? Don't know if that has something to do with growing up abroad and there being different cultural mores in other countries. Certainly there were different cultural mores in Paris. But we are told that he got along with the indigenous people very well, which are rudely referred to as Seminole. That's not what they call themselves. It's derived from a Spanish word for runaway and rebel. So it's a diminutive name. It's an insulting name. But anyway, Seminoles, they're still referred to as, they refer to themselves as Seminole. But there's no tribe called the Seminoles. It's like calling that Inuit, Eskimo, or Black people coons. It's insulting. But anyway, the indigenous people took it on, interestingly enough. Osceola, being a famous Seminole, actually he was Pasiki or Creek, but again, I digress. We're supposed to believe that young John got along with the Seminole, traded with them, and respected their rights around his land. Consequently, they didn't raid his plantation. But during the Second Seminole War mess, there was a Captain Putnam, who Putnam County is now named after, who was leading a flank of Federals in the attempt to summon these savages that were marauding and burning and refusing to do as they were told. And Bilo is said to have sent some scouts out to speak to Captain Putnam and his men and say, hey, stay off our land. We don't want any part of this. But that didn't go over very well. So what he is said to have done is to have fired a cannonball in their general direction, saying, stay out. We don't want you here. That resulted in his arrest. He was placed under house arrest in his own home. And then when they decided that having him there just made it too difficult, they decided to ship him off to St. Augustine and held him prisoner in the fort in the Castillo San Marcos, a place where they had also held Osceola. Again, the stories change here. There's more than one story about that. Some say they let him just continue to live in his house. But then why did he die in St. Augustine, I ask you? And then there are stories that talk about him being sent to St. Augustine and jailed either at the Castillo or at the governor's house, being freed here, not allowed to go back to his plantation, and dying here, or dying here in jail. Either way, on the night of January 31st, 1836, the story goes that wherever he was, he happened to look south and saw the flames of his plantation burning. Once he was taken off the land and his family was removed for safety, the Federales took over the plantation and the Indians did what they did. Burned it down, like they burned down every plantation in the region. Well, so you can imagine the kid was only 26, and this was pretty upsetting. Everything that he had inherited at a very young age had been destroyed. He was destroyed. And that he died just a few months later at the age of 26. And so both buried in the cemetery. And I don't know about a lot of the burials here. It's unfortunate I couldn't get in. But you see that there also are raised crypts. No, this is not New Orleans, but it is flood land just the same. Now, no telling of stories of St. Augustine or cemeteries or anything to do with Castillo San Marcos would be complete without a reference to Potter's Wax Museum that sits at the corner of Orange and Cordova. Orange Street was a moat back in the day because the Kubo line, the earthen works, wood, and cactus fortification stood there. Potter's used to be an apothecary, and it was in Potter's apothecary that story goes the doctor who had been taking care of the Seminole warrior Osceola at the end of his young life and dying from tumors in his throat. When he passed away painfully in the Castillo San Marcos, when he was being prepared for burial, this doctor, an American, cut off his head and sold it to the man who owned Potter's apothecary, the chemist, the apothecary, and that his head, Osceola's head, was preserved in alcohol in a jar, and people would pay to come and look at the head of Osceola. I've never been in there. I've been by it numerous times. It's got a really bad vibe. Realizing that at the time, this kind of thing wasn't uncommon. Graves were robbed all the time. That's how doctors and chemists and scientists learned about things, as they worked on the dead. And so there was a market in corpse parts. Osceola, of course, was a famous person, alive and dead. I think that there was a lot of trade in corpses and body parts in this building. Prosthetics at a time when people were coming off of Indian wars and civil wars, and there were a lot of injured men missing appendages. And there was a lot of casting of body parts for these very primary, elementary prosthetics that were made. And you can see some of them in the window when you walk by. The place just has a really bad vibe. I don't know anyone who has anything good to say about walking in there, other than it's eerie and beyond morbid. So I can't tell you any more about that than what I just did. There's lots of research. I just get such a bad vibe from the place I've never been in. But given that we were talking about dead bodies and cemeteries and people being locked up at Castillo San Marcos, I felt it good to talk about Potters. I also don't think that you can talk about interesting burial stories in St. Augustine without talking about the Dade pyramids, the three, we are to believe, pyramid ossuaries that are 11 feet wide at the base on all four sides and over 8 feet tall, supposedly holding the remains of about 1,500 men who died in the three Indian wars, and the Dade obelisk beside them. So the Bulow ruins are quite a fabulous place. I enjoy them. I think they're quite beautiful. There's a lot to learn. Flagler Beach is a community that started to spring up right before the crash in the Obama years. There were great tracts of developments and malls and things that were planned, and everything just dried up. And the Flagler Beach, Palm Coast area became a very sad, undeveloped region. It's just housing development after housing development. There's very little infrastructure around it. Efforts have been made to build up the infrastructure around there, and parks and that type of thing are included in that. Now it's full of canals and retention ponds and interesting bodies of water. To a certain extent, that was already there. But of course, we know that during plantation days, there were a great many canals that were built. I won't go into what I think about canals, like what Michelle Gibson thinks about canals, how they were there before we got there, and the developments that occurred around the canals happened because of the canals that were already there. Florida is constantly changing, especially this region of Florida, because of all the creeks and rivers. So I don't know. You decide what you want to decide about all that. I just wanted to draw note to this interesting park that I discovered in my research here. Palm Coast Memorial Park has a bocce ball court, tennis courts, pickleball, a large playground area, trails, the likes. Like everything else in Flagler and Palm Coast, lots of canals. But what's interesting is the founders incorporated the Bilo ruins design into the park itself. Now, this all could have been on Bulowville land. I don't know. I haven't looked at an aerial photograph to find out if it was. 6,000 acres is a lot of property. There's the gate. Now, I'm not sure, because I haven't been there, if that was built to look like the ruins, or if it actually is part of the ruins. I'm not sure, but the style is interesting. And then there is one of the playgrounds where, again, the ruins are incorporated into the jungle gym. Now, it appears that there is education there at the park. There are plaques and things that talk about the Bulowville Plantation. It's called Memorial Park because it is full of service memorial areas, all the armed forces. I don't know if I see this type of thing as appropriation and morbid or sick, or if I think it's cool. I'm not sure. Interesting way to include history into play. Again, I could join the many people who have busted through the chain link fence on a wall that borders with the visitor center, or just hop over the fence, which is only about 4 feet tall, the coquina fence that surrounds it on 3 sides, and walk in and do what I wanted to do. It's certainly been done. I've also just today started using a video editing platform. So we'll see how this worked out. I've been using this for the first time. I just downloaded it and started finding out how it works. So we'll see how this works together. Hopefully this makes a easier viewing, better viewing experience for you. But I'm going to end that right there. There's plenty for you to further research on your own. And if you look up the Huguenot Cemetery, you will find a complete listing of the interned bodies that have markers associated with them. If you're looking for someone in particular, there's a complete list online available. So I want to thank you for hanging out with me again today. Thank you for my Unguru family, Melanie, Michelle, and Buffy. Thank you for your comments, your coffees, your support, your text messages, your phone calls. Thank you for all of that. Thank you for your inquiries on Buy Me a Coffee and membership. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all your support. I'm going to leave this right here and make another cup of coffee. Thank you for hanging out with Medusa Was Framed. I'm Joyce, and I'll see you next time.